Hello everybody. Today we are going to deal with a strategic approach to crisis management. Effective crisis management requires that managers understand both the source of crisis events and strategies required needed to identify and prepare for them. A crisis rarely occurs out of the blue. A crisis usually follows one or more warning signs. Typically, a series of preconditioned events occur before a crisis can come in. These events eventually lead to a trigger event that ultimately causes the crisis. The warning signs of an evolving crisis may not be identified until it is too late, either because decision makers are not aware of them or because they do not recognize them as serious threats. The chapter examines crisis management from a strategic point of view. First, an overview of challenges managers face when they assess the external environment, particularly its uncertainty. Then we proceed to heart of identifying the potential crisis and employ SWOT analysis: strength, weakness, opportunity, and threats. Four critical distinctions of strategic orientation are: it is based on a systematic, comprehensive analysis of internal attributes referred to as opportunities and threats. It is long-term and future-oriented. It is distinctively opportunistic and involves many important choices, and we cannot prepare for every choice, so we have to prioritize. Strategic management process consists of 5 steps. One is the external analysis, where the opportunities and threats in the organization's macro environment, including industry and external forces. Then the internal analysis, analyze the organization's strength and weakness in the internal environment. Then we have formulating the strategies, that is, build sustainable competitive advantage by matching the organization's strength and weaknesses with the environment's opportunities and threats. Strategy execution, implement strategies developed in the formulation is that step where you execute the strategy. And strategy control is engaged in strategy control activities when the strategies are not producing the desired outcome. So you have to engage in activities when your strategy is not working. You have to control it. The overall crisis management program must include top executives and members of the management team. The chief executive is ultimately accountable for the organization's strategic management and any crisis that emerges. External analysis. In the first step, again, managers identify the sources of crisis in the firm's external environment. The organizational external opportunities and threats are identified to determine specific vulnerabilities in the organization which is of concern. Government regulations often formed in response to a previous crisis are also a part of external environmental analysis. Internal analysis is focusing on vulnerabilities within the organization that may result during a crisis. Typically, organizations' internal strengths and weaknesses are identified to identify vulnerability. Strategy formulation and implementation is the third stage, and the fourth stage where it looks at developing and executing firm strategies at various functional levels. Indeed, some strategies are more prone to crisis events than others. Strategy control is helpful in crisis management because it often signals a future problem. Outcomes are assessed in strategic control stage. Once completed, the organizations must counter undesirable or unanticipated consequences that emanate from strategy. When a strategy is executed as planned, control may be minimal. When execution difficulties exist or unforeseen arise, the nature of strategic control may need to change the crisis prevention or crisis response. So next is understanding the environmental uncertainty. Preventing crisis would be more manageable if managers always had the perfect information, but they do not. An essential step in the strategic management process, analyzing the external environment, presents one of the most critical challenges for preventing crisis: understanding and managing environmental uncertainty. Managers must develop a systematic process to obtain information about organization's environment. Ideally, top managers should be aware of the multitude of external forces that influence an organization's activity. Uncertainty occurs when decision makers lack current, sufficient, reliable information and cannot accurately forecast future changes. In practice, decision makers in an organization must be able to render decisions when environmental conditions are uncertain. So there is one thing which is not mentioned in the book, and that is bounded rationality. At any given point of time, you will not have all the information to make decisions. You have a bounded rationality, because that is what is called bounded rationality, where you will not have all the information available. So you have to make decisions based on the information available at that point of time. Managing environmental uncertainty also requires several techniques. First consideration is whether the organization should adapt to this environment, or in some cases attempt to influence or change it. Occasionally, a business may seek to change its environment to protect it from crisis. Other techniques like buffering can also be used, a common approach where organizations establish departments to absorb uncertainty from the environment and buffer its effects. Another technique is imitation, an approach where the organization mimics a successful key competitor. Presumably, organizations that imitate their competitors reduce uncertainty by pursuing safety in numbers. Concept of imitation is paramount in crisis management, as companies seek to learn what other organizations are doing to avoid crisis. So they learn from the other companies when they imitate. The next concept which is of importance is the environmental scanner. Environmental scanning refers to collecting and analyzing information about relevant trends in the external environment. A systematic environmental scanning process reduces uncertainty and organizes the flow of current information relevant to organizational decisions. So you are now collecting information to make that decision. Also, scanning provides decision makers with an early warning system, an essential element in risk identification. Because organization members often lack critical knowledge and information, they may scan the environment by interacting with outsiders, a process known as boundary spanning. So environmental scanning is meant to be future oriented, that it provides basis for making strategic decisions. The goal is to provide an effective environmental scanning to provide information relevant to the firm. So environmental scanning should be viewed as a continuous process. Top managers must plan for and identify organizations' type of information to support strategic decision making. A system for obtaining this information is then developed. Information is collected, analyzed, and disseminated to the appropriate decision makers, usually within the firm's functional areas, and this information must be acted upon. Large organizations may engage in environmental scanning activities by employing one or more individuals whose sole responsibility is to obtain, process, and distribute important environmental information to their organization's decision makers. In contrast, decision makers at smaller organizations must rely on trade publications or periodicals such as Wall Street Journal to remain abreast of changes that may affect their organization. A potential lack of objectivity can be a concern when managers evaluate the external environment because they perceive selectively through the lens on their own experiences, professional expertise, and operating departments. Managers with expertise in some functional regions may be more interested in evaluating information about their functions rather than looking at other options. The problem with this viewpoint is that critical elements from the environment may be ignored. Factors that may pose future risk that could actually develop into a crisis. Identifying potential crisis using SWOT analysis. In strategic planning, the SWOT analysis is used to determine an organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The SWOT analysis should also be used to assess crisis vulnerability during the strategic planning process. Using the SWOT analysis to identify such threats is a major planning tool in assessing crisis vulnerability. Now look at strengths. Typically, internal strengths would not be thought to be contributing to a potential crisis. However, a track record of the organizational success can blind management to perceiving warning signals from a potential crisis, and several organizational strengths can eventually lead to the problems. For example, if you are growing excessively, which would deem a desirable performance outcome, can offset by problems with high depth and an overemphasis on expanding through company acquisitions. In this respect, strength can in fact lead to crisis. And another example is a strong leader in the organization can lead to a top-down culture in which followers put blind faith in the leader and fail to approach the leader's strategies with skeptical questioning. The situation is further exacerbated when the board of directors rubber stamp the CEO's agenda, often failing to challenge top management with tough questions and instead exhibiting something called groupthink, further putting the balance of power dangerously in favor of CEO. This is especially when somebody with a dictator type mentality comes into power, and servant leadership can help a lot to prevent this type of things in your organization. Weaknesses. The connection between organizational weaknesses and crisis is both intuitive and well established. The weaknesses identified in the SWOT should be examined in light of their potential for breeding crisis in the organization. An emphasis on the human resource management HRM function is directly related to the organization's potential for crisis events. Specifically, when an organization ignores good human resources HR practices, a crisis is more likely to occur. All other things being equal, organizations are better off when these employees are well trained, loyal, and reasonably satisfied with their employment. And the opportunities include, while they may not seem to be apparent that organizational opportunities could be a potential of crisis, a closer examination suggests that it can be. The assessment of opportunities can generate alternatives of a company may pursue to expand its market share. Problems can surface and escalate into a crisis, particularly as the firm considers globalization options. Companies that generate online sales are open to crises associated with cybersecurity, including theft of personal records of consumers and denial of service attacks, DOS, by hackers. And the next one is a threat, final one. External threats are common source of crisis. Some of these factors can be opportunities in some organizations, but threats in others. In some organizations, threats emanate from geographical consideration. For example, in parts of the United States, such as Florida, weather concerns such as hurricanes are included in the risk assessment. Urban areas of any country can be subject to crises that are different from less populated areas. Events such as riots, power outages, and bad weather can be tough on more populated areas. Organizational culture and crisis planning. There is a way of thinking and way things are done in every organization, and organizational theorists call it organizational or corporate culture. Culture refers to commonly held values and beliefs of a particular group of people. Organizational culture is a more specific concept. It refers to the shared values and patterns of beliefs and behavior accepted and practiced by the members of a particular organization. An organization's crisis vulnerability is related or linked to its cultural norms and assumptions. In other words, being diligent about crisis planning involves a cultural shift. Many managers are engrossed with putting out today's fires and do not think they have the time to plan for tomorrow's contingency. Therefore, they have not developed critical tools and created or needed for a comprehensive crisis management plan. there are other managers who are more proactive in their conduct. They plan for future potential crises by presupposing what could be their worst case predicament. Yet another group of managers includes battle-scarred victims. That means they have already gone through these bad experiences, who have experienced organizational crisis, are now involved in proactive planning so they can manage future crises more effectively. So we discussed with the strategies for dealing with organizational crisis. Thank you very much.